Welcome to Meet the Candidates. Frankfort Plant Board has given us an opportunity to bring candidates in here to sit down and talk with us a little bit about what they see as being the issues and who they are as people in our community. So we're going to be exploring this opportunity at this edition with a candidate for City Commission. Delvin Asafefa is joining us here in the studios, and we're going to get to learn a little bit about him. And before we step into that, I would like to remind you to stay alert to news about the Candidate Forum, April 26th, down at the hotel, and then be sure that you stay tuned for our live broadcast of the results of the primary, May 22nd. We'll be broadcasting from the county clerk's office, and we'll bring you those numbers just as soon as we have them. And one of the reasons we get those numbers is because we get to meet our candidates. And Delvin, I am so glad to get a chance to meet you. I'm sure there are many people in the community that know you quite well, but we have a number of people in the community, such as myself, who haven't had a chance to talk with you personally.
Yes, ma'am.
So tell us a little bit about who you are, what your function is within our community, and why in the world you have decided that you are willing to take on the responsibility of serving in this position.
Well, I suppose I can tell you that originally I'm from Louisville. I grew up in a rough neighborhood. I grew up in poverty, and so I know what it is like to struggle. Being here in this community, this will be the 12th year I've been here, along with my wife and my son, who goes to Franklin County. He's an athlete there. He wrestles, he played basketball, he's currently on track. So I definitely believe that in order for this community to grow, we absolutely need to have something for our young people to do. Unfortunately, in this community, I've lost somebody to the epidemic of drugs. And I understand, because of my background, when young people don't have anything to do, they find things to do, and they're usually not the things that parents would approve of. So I would absolutely like to see some type of improvement for activities for kids, especially when it comes to the non-revenue sports. I work at the University of Kentucky Athletics. One thing that I noticed while working there, a lot of the events, I'd think to myself, why isn't Frankfort represented? Are they just that terrible? I would see athletes from surrounding counties, but not often in Frankfort, and I would wonder why. During the campaign trail, I've been speaking to folks in the community, and I found out that we just don't have the facilities to support world-class athletes here. And that's an absolute shame, especially when you consider the millions of dollars out there in scholarship opportunities for those kids. And if we don't have places for them to practice, it's really hard for them to picture being a world-class athlete.
Do you see any avenues that we could approach to accomplish that? Are there any proposals that you might have for us to look at? How do we go about it?
I have an idea, but I'm not sure. I've talked to some people and they like it. I was thinking one avenue we could expand the Y, where the old expo has been, the convention center has been destroyed. I've seen YMCAs that are totally beautiful, and you can replace those activities that were lost through the convention center. It doesn't have to be an expansion of the Y, but it has to be some type of 21st century world-class facility for students and kids and their families to be able to compete and to interact.
Well, of course, there has been a lot of talk about whether we should or whether we should not try to replace the actual convention center, a multi-use facility, or if we should replace it with something other than that. Do you have thoughts along those lines, and how would we go about doing that?
Again, this is one of those things where I'm constantly talking to people in the community to find out what their ideas are. For example, the folks on the swim team. I remember a student who was an avid swimmer. She was really good, and I spoke to her the other day and talked about the lack of facilities, and she thought it was almost laughable. And so there are another component of the community that don't have kids, or they have had kids so long ago they're not in touch with what's going on with the young people today. So it's definitely going to have to take some brainstorming on my part, connecting with folks in the community. But more than likely, ultimately, I see a P3 opportunity, a private-public partnership to create whatever venue that it'll be, but it has to be something that'll serve as a function for our kids in this community.
I have no clue. Do you know how we would go about seeking out that way of putting together those partnerships?
One of the things that I can tell you, as you probably are aware, we've received a Tiger grant recently. There are plenty of grant opportunities out there. There are plenty of private entities that are out there that would love to invest in a place like Frankfort that has relatively low utility costs, relatively low costs of living. There are a lot of aspects of Frankfort which makes it attractive for incoming businesses, and we just have to locate those entities and capitalize on them.
Any idea how to go about that?
One thing that I can tell you that I've thought about is in this community, I was a part of Capital City Martial Arts under John W. Mason II. Through the martial arts, I was able to realize how many sponsors there are for athletics. And so through that alone, I'm able to understand to a limited degree of how we're able to bring those things in, but through a martial arts capacity. But I know that we have folks who are in charge of basketball, AAU programs, and those type of things that would attract folks to come to Frankfort.
I know that you mentioned the Tiger Grant, and everybody's very excited about that. How do you see that development of the 2nd Street corridor? And do you anticipate going around to do similar things in the rest of the downtown Frankfort area?
It's hard to say, because the first thing that I think we absolutely have to address is the lack of safety for the kids at 2nd Street School. I used to work at 2nd Street School, and I've seen kids almost get taken out several times. And to tell you the truth, I've almost been taken out several times. I'm not exactly sure what we need to do specifically to address that, but that has to be addressed. As far as other developments in Frankfort, again, it's hard for me to say because of the City Vision's proposals that have yet to come to fruition. So I'm not exactly sure if they're gonna slow walk the Tiger Grant, so to speak, or if they're gonna accelerate the progress and let the City Vision's people do whatever they're gonna do on their own.
What do you see about funding potential? Are we going to be able to really deeply address the City Vision's concepts when they're presented? How do we come up with money, do you think, for doing that? And part of that, I hate to make it so complicated, but part of that is going to be the pension crisis affecting the city budget. Have you been able to look at that in any degree and see what precise effect that's going to have on the budget and what we can possibly do to compensate for it?
Here's what bothers me about the idea of the budget, and it's been recently touched on at our city council meeting. Several years ago, our first responders and other city employees lost their longevity pay increases. From what I understood, this was generally about 1% raise each year. And right now, we're almost at a crisis point with our first responders. They're able to attract people, but over the long term, they aren't able to keep people here. And one of the reasons that that is extremely important to me is because I believe in community policing. Like I mentioned to you earlier, I'm from a rough neighborhood in Louisville. And when I was a kid, one of the things that was a normal sight is for the police officers to play basketball with the kids. It was a common sight for the police to have their car in front of your house, but they would have lemonade or tea or something like that. Mm-hmm. So a lot of time the police already knew who were criminals before they actually committed crimes, and they would talk to people. My dad was a diabetic, and unfortunately, he didn't take very good care of himself. So a lot of time the ambulance and the EMS team would come out and say, "Hey, D, we know that you're probably not taking this," and they would give him his right dosage and get him together. Whereas the situation that we have right now, over time, we would like to have stability in the community, and it starts by having stability in our first responder program. So when you're talking about the budget, there are things that we're going to have to address, and I don't know exactly how, but we have to, absolutely have to increase the pay of our first responders.
One of the things that has come to our attention as needing to be a question for candidates is here in Frankfort, the mayor makes appointments to boards. That has been in contention a little bit lately. Do you think that the city commission should have oversight of those appointments?
The way that I imagine that is just like how the president is responsible for making judicial appointments, for example, and the Congress has to approve of those. That's the same role that I see it in the city council. There should be a separation of powers in that sense. The mayor is the executive official, and the commissioners are the legislative branch. So once you start to give one branch powers from another branch, it becomes unequal, and that, in my mind, begins the destruction of our beautiful democracy that we have.
Another point that I wanted to make sure that we cover across the board with all the candidates is, do you feel that there should be representatives from industry that are appointed to the Frankfort Plant Board?
I can't say overall, and you could have somebody in an industry, but it doesn't match. For example, you could have somebody who's an oil baron and put them in charge of the environment, and it's probably not going to make a lot of sense. So it wouldn't have to be just because they're in industry. They would have to have some type of qualifications that will be relevant to the position that they're seeking.
And as a correlation to that, the plant board obviously supplies services to areas that are not always contained within the city limits. Do you feel that there should be a representative from the county area?
Absolutely. One of the things that seemed strange to me is the small controversy with appointing Mr. Steve Mason, because he lived in the county. From what I understood, the paperwork showed that he lived in the county, but for some reason they made it an issue. But to me, they definitely need representation. And even when you think about the basic function of our democracy, isn't that what the Boston Tea Party was for?
Okay. Another question that we want to make sure goes to all of them across the board is, what is your opinion about this plant board composition investigation of those people who are serving on the board?
From what I understand, KRS statute puts the government of Frankfort in charge of the appointments and dismissals of folks in the plant board. To me, being somebody on the outside looking in, maybe there's some type of secret documents I'm not privy to, but under my understanding, if they don't like them, fire them. We don't need the false investigations to hire somebody for $20,000 for 30 days, which they actually didn't finish that, and they extorted the city for an additional $10,000, which again isn't in the best interest of folks in Frankfort who are taxpayers. While I was at the city commission meeting, I was taken aback at how easy it was for them to vote an additional $10,000 for this. Right now, we do have a surplus in the city, but if we use just a little bit of common sense, if we keep spending and don't replace, we're going to be in trouble.
Do you have any proposals for resolution of this issue? I mean, how should we go about fixing this problem?
I think the appointment of Mr. Steve Mason is a good first step. Mr. Mason is very qualified. He's very intelligent, and I think that we need to give him a little bit of time to see what happens there.
What kind of ideas are you going to bring to the City Commission for consideration of all of the commission members about how we proceed to improve and develop this community?
The first thing goes back to what I was just speaking about. We absolutely can't conduct business with entities that are out to extort us. When we assign somebody to finish a contract, it's a contract, period. So if they come back crawling and begging for more money, we should say no. We should set an example. We should put our foot down and say, this is not the way that business is done in Frankfort. When, again, I grew up in poverty, when my mother would send me to the grocery store with $5 and say, hey, you better bring back some butter and some bread. Well, I better not bring back Now Laters, Jawbreakers. I better not bring back a can of soda. You understand? So because I grew up in that, I understood and still understand the importance of spending somebody else's money. And you have to spend it like it's yours. You can't spend it like there's no tomorrow, or else that is going to lead us into a place that we don't want to be.
What is your assessment of how we're spending our money? Are there areas that you think that we should cut back on in order to have more dollars to place into different areas? How do you see the use of that particular budget, and are there changes you think we should make to it?
One of the things that brings me a bit of concern is the size of Firehouse One. Again, we have to focus on our first responders, and those folks are getting up at 2, 3 in the morning while we're sound asleep. They're running toward a place that everybody is running away from, and we have to take care of them. So one of the things, again, we have to look into the budget and figure out a way to increase the pay of our first responders, and we have to make sure that they're equipped the way that they need to address 21st century dangers and threats.
Are there areas where you think we could draw some dollars because they're not being used effectively so that we could ensure that those things happen?
One of the things that I can tell you in terms of that, when I think about Frankfort High School, when I think about 2nd Street School and the lack of funding that they get because of the low property values and the lack of taxes they're able to create, we're really going to have to be creative in creating new revenue streams for this city. And unless we create new revenue streams, then we're going to go back to the old, let's just tax everybody. And the problem with that is once people tax, they get used to having that extra money and they forget about reducing spending. So one thing that I definitely don't want to do is talk about increasing taxes. We're taxed enough already.
Do you have any proposals of how we could develop those revenue streams other than taxing?
One of the things that I know that they're talking about in the legislature is to bring in some form of legalized gambling, and I am definitely for that. In Kentucky, we lie to ourselves and we pretend to ourselves that we're too good for that. Even though we have Keeneland, even though we have Churchill Downs, even though we have bingo in churches. But yet and still there are people out there that say, no, gambling is just a horrible thing and it's going to lead to the death of Kentucky. Well, if it does, then, you know, I'd like a piece of what Churchill Downs has to offer.
Are there issues? I have to admit, I am not the most knowledgeable about all of the issues facing this community. Are there issues that you would like to address here today that I have not brought up?
One of the things, because we briefly mentioned drugs, and one of the things that I think would definitely go a long way, again, is to change the way that our police do business. We have to have a community-oriented police strategy. We have to have officers outside of their cars, because sometimes the car presents itself as a barrier. And when people feel that they are different from the police, it creates a form of animosity that that isn't healthy for our community to heal and to get together and grow.
Which also leads us to another question that we haven't really been covering much, is how do you deal with the drug issue without appropriate treatment facilities?
That is exactly it. We have to have appropriate treatment facilities. I know that some people argue that we can just lock our way out of the problem, but in my view, those voices don't have a clear understanding of what it is. These hard drugs change the chemistry of somebody's brain. Again, I've mentioned somebody who I lost to drugs, and this was a military veteran. This was somebody who would give you the shirt off his back, very knowledgeable, very talented. And if the scourge of drugs can reach somebody like that, then none of us are safe. And again, it begins with community policing. It begins with not just trying to lock our way out of this situation, because when we sit back and think about the losing war on drugs that we have, it's not a winner. We incarcerate more people in this country than Cuba, Russia, and North Korea. And when you consider that, and we're supposed to be a beacon of freedom, that sounds like hypocrisy to me. So we actually absolutely have to get some sort of treatment facilities.
Do you have any thoughts on how we go about correcting that situation? Because it is pervasive. How do we fund such a thing?
One of the things that I know is already happening is several of the faith-based organizations and churches have programs. I know that some of the youth service centers in schools have programs. But what I see as a problem is that everybody has their programs, but these programs aren't connected. The programs need to be able to talk to each other so they're able to maximize the help that they can offer to people.
Well, I know that, as I said, there are a lot of issues here in this community, and there are a multitude of ways of approaching them that haven't come in my purview yet. So if you have anything that we've not touched on, and I know we've just skimmed the surface of all of those, but if there are areas that you would like to discuss, now would be the time to do it.
Well, the thing that I can tell you is that we absolutely have to do something about school safety. I'm a school teacher by trade, and I find it laughable when people's answer is to arm the teachers. And I'm a third-degree black belt. I'm trained to use a weapon, but not everybody has my training. I trained with one of the best, in my opinion, John W. Mason II. Unfortunately, he passed away in the year 2012. But there is a night and day difference between learning to shoot a sitting target and being able to have tactical training where you're able to complete the mission despite the screams, despite the noise, despite the heat, or any other hostile threats. And just arming a teacher isn't it. So I would actually like to do some research and find out how we would be able to possibly fund some homeless, underemployed, or unemployed veterans to have them to staff our schools. And those are the people who we need to protect us, not teachers.
I really appreciate you taking the time to come in here and give us an opportunity to get to know more about you. And we hope to see you on further candidate interviews. Before we close out of here, though, and we do have a limited time, would you please tell the viewers why you're the best candidate and why they should go into the polls and cast their vote for you?
Absolutely. One thing, I'm just a regular person. I don't have any long-term goals for politics. Every few years, people would knock on my door telling me what they were going to do for Frankfort and how they were going to improve Frankfort. And I haven't seen the improvements that I expected to see when these people have been telling me this for over 10 years. And I sat around and I thought to myself, well, somebody else is going to do it. Somebody else is going to do it. And then I realized nobody's going to do it unless I step into those shoes and do it my daggone self.
We will see your name on the ballot on May the 22nd. I want to alert our viewers that we're going to have a candidate forum on April 26th. Stay alert for the details. Participate if you possibly can. Submit some questions if you'd like. And then join us for our live coverage of the election results on May 22nd from the county clerk's office. Participate in every opportunity to get to know these candidates so that you can cast an informed vote. And to do that, make sure you come back here for Meet the Candidates.